I had barely lowered myself into my chair when Brandon picked up the leather check presenter, slid it across the white tablecloth, and stopped it directly in front of me. He leaned back with a satisfied smile. "You're paying right." The conversations died instantly. 16 pairs of eyes settled on me. Some curious, some expectant, some almost amused. I looked down at the closed folder without touching it. Around me sat my daughter Olivia, my son-in-law, my sister, 2 cousins, Brandon's parents, nieces, nephews, even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Half-empty wine glasses glittered beneath the chandelier. Lobster shells were piled onto serving plates. The aroma of Wagyu beef still hung in the room. Someone had ordered a seafood tower that probably cost more than my first car. No one looked surprised. That was the first thing that told me everything. This wasn't an awkward misunderstanding. This had been planned. Olivia reached across the table and forced a nervous smile. "Dad, it's just dinner." Brandon chuckled. "And family takes care of family." I slowly looked from face to face. Not one person spoke. Not one person questioned why I'd supposedly agreed to pay for a meal I'd never ordered. Instead of arguing, I stood up. "I'll be right back." Brandon laughed behind me. "See, I told you he'd do the right thing." I walked calmly across the restaurant toward the manager's station. The manager greeted me with a polite smile, reserved for expensive private events. I leaned closer and quietly said only 2 sentences. His smile disappeared immediately. He gave one slow nod, turned without another word, and walked straight toward the reservation office. At that moment, I knew something Brandon didn't. And 15 minutes later, everything would change. 3 days earlier, my phone had buzzed with a message I never thought I'd receive. "Dad, can we have dinner? I'd really like to make things right." I read those words at least 20 times before replying. For 3 years, there had been nothing. No birthday calls. No Christmas cards. No Father's Day messages. Nothing except silence. When Olivia cut me out of her life, she'd done it completely. I'd spent months wondering whether I should reach out. Then months convincing myself she probably needed space. Eventually, I accepted that maybe I'd lost my daughter forever. So when her message appeared, hope came rushing back faster than caution. She suggested an upscale steakhouse downtown. "Just us," she'd written. "I want to talk." I arrived 15 minutes early. I even wore the navy sport coat she'd bought me years before for my retirement dinner. It still fit. Barely. As the hostess led me toward the private dining room, I rehearsed what I wanted to say. I wasn't planning to argue about the past. I simply wanted my daughter back. The doors opened. Instead of finding Olivia sitting alone, I froze. 16 people filled the private room. Surprise! Several relatives clapped. My older sister waved enthusiastically. Brandon's parents smiled from the opposite end of the table. Even cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years were there. For one confusing second, I actually thought they'd organized some sort of reconciliation celebration. Then Olivia hurried over. She hugged me tightly. The first hug I'd received from my daughter in 3 years. "I missed you, Dad." My throat tightened. "I missed you too." For a moment, I believed her. Brandon appeared beside us carrying 2 wine glasses. "There he is," he announced loudly. The guest of honor finally made it. Everyone applauded again. I smiled awkwardly and took the only empty chair. Almost immediately, something felt off. Every entree was already on the table. Huge platters of lobster. perfectly sliced Wagyu steaks, seafood towers overflowing with oysters and king crab. Side dishes covered nearly every inch of the table. A bottle of wine sat empty beside another that had just been opened. They hadn't been waiting for me. They'd already eaten. As servers continued clearing finished plates, I realized no one asked about my retirement. No one asked where I'd been. No one asked what 3 years apart had been like. Instead, conversations drifted toward vacations, new cars, Brandon's latest business venture, and expensive restaurants. Whenever I tried asking Olivia how she'd been, someone interrupted. Whenever I mentioned the years we'd lost, Brandon smoothly redirected the conversation. "So, Michael," he laughed, raising his glass, "retirement must leave you with plenty of money to enjoy life now." Several relatives laughed politely. I forced a smile. Something about the entire evening felt rehearsed, like everyone already knew their roles except me. Then the servers cleared the final dessert plates. A waiter quietly handed Brandon a black leather folder. He didn't even open it. He simply slid it across the table until it rested directly in front of me. Brandon smiled. "You're paying right." The room became so quiet I could hear glasses settling against the tablecloth. Nobody looked confused. Nobody objected. They were all waiting to see what I'd do. I stood without raising my voice, without touching the check, without looking at Brandon. I walked directly to the restaurant manager, bent slightly closer, and whispered 2 short sentences. He stared at me for a long second, then nodded once, before turning toward the reservation office without saying another word. Why had those 2 quiet sentences changed everything? Brandon leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and grinned as I returned to the table. "There we go," he said loudly. "I knew Michael was just arranging payment." A few relatives nodded as though the matter had already been settled. One of my cousins even raised his wine glass. "That's generous of you, Mike." I didn't correct him. Not yet. Instead, I sat down, straightened my napkin, and quietly poured myself a glass of water. The silence seemed to make Brandon even more confident. He flashed Olivia a satisfied smile. "See, I told you he'd come through." Olivia smiled weakly, but something about it didn't reach her eyes. She looked at me for a second, almost as if she expected me to say something. I simply took a sip of water. Watching. Waiting. 3 years earlier, I never imagined I'd be sitting across from my daughter like this. Back then, Brandon had called me almost every other month. Not to ask how I was. Not because he wanted advice. He always needed money. First, it was an investment opportunity. Then a restaurant partnership. Then an online distribution company. Every idea sounded like the one that would finally make him successful. Every one of them failed. Each time I stepped in, I paid overdue rent, covered business loans, helped with credit card balances, even emptied part of my retirement savings once because Olivia cried and told me they were about to lose everything. I never kept score. She was my daughter. Helping her felt natural. But after years of watching the same cycle repeat, I finally said no. "I'm retired now," I told Brandon. "I have to protect what's left." His smile disappeared instantly. "So your money matters more than your family?" "No," I answered. "My future matters too." Olivia had stared at me as though I'd betrayed her. "I can't believe you'd abandon us." "I've never abandoned you," I'd replied. "I've just stopped funding bad decisions." Within a week, my calls went unanswered. Birthday messages were ignored. Christmas came and went without hearing her voice. Then Father's Day passed. Nothing. 3 years of silence because I refused to write another check. That's why her text had meant so much. Dad, can we make things right? I'd believed every word. Now, sitting in that private dining room, I realized something painful. Not once since I'd arrived had Olivia asked how I was doing. She hadn't asked about my retirement. She hadn't asked about my health. She hadn't even asked whether I was happy. Every conversation circled back to money, to expensive vacations, luxury purchases, business ideas. And Brandon kept dropping little comments. You've always been the generous one. You always took care of everyone. We're lucky to have someone who believes family comes first. Each remark sounded casual. Together they felt rehearsed. Then I noticed something else. Whenever I stood or walked toward another relative, conversation stopped. People exchanged quick glances. A few lowered their voices, almost like they were afraid of saying something they weren't supposed to. This wasn't just Brandon's performance. Everyone had been given a version of the story. The only question was whether they'd all been told the same one. The restaurant manager quietly approached my chair. He bent slightly toward me. Mr. Carter. Yes. In your conversation just now, he asked one short question. You are confirming you did not organize or authorize this dinner. I looked him directly in the eye. That's correct. He gave a polite nod. Thank you, that's all I needed. Without another word, he walked away. I could almost feel Brandon relaxing across the table. He mistook that brief conversation for surrender. He stood, lifted his wine glass, and laughed. I'd like to make a toast. Several relatives raised theirs with him. To family. Everyone echoed him. To family. Brandon looked directly at me. And to the man who's always understood that family pays for family. A few people clapped softly. I set my glass down, looked straight back at him, and answered calmly enough for everyone in the room to hear. We'll find out who actually agreed to pay. The smile slowly faded from Brandon's face. Brandon's smile barely had time to disappear before the restaurant manager returned. This time he wasn't alone. A woman in a charcoal suit walked beside him, carrying a slim folder. Her name tag identified her as the restaurant's operations director. The room quieted again. Several relatives assumed they were bringing the payment terminal. Instead, the manager stopped beside Brandon. Mr. Ellis, he said politely, may we speak with you for just a moment? Brandon frowned. Why, he's paying. He pointed directly at me. The manager remained composed. We only need to clarify a few details regarding the reservation. Brandon laughed. There's nothing to clarify. He nudged the leather check folder toward me again. My father-in-law is taking care of everything. The operations director didn't even glance at me. Sir, we'd still appreciate a brief conversation. Around the table, puzzled expressions began replacing confident smiles. My cousin Denise looked at Brandon. I thought Michael offered to celebrate. So did I, my older sister added. You told us he wanted to make up for lost time, Brandon's mother said. Another relative chimed in. You said he insisted on treating everybody. For the first time all evening, the stories didn't line up. Brandon blinked. Well, yes, that's basically what happened. I remained silent. There was no need to interrupt. The contradictions were arriving on their own. Olivia slowly turned toward her husband. You told me Dad wanted everyone here. He did. She frowned. No, you said this dinner was his idea. It was. But my invitation was supposed to be just him and me. The room became noticeably quieter. Every person at that table had apparently heard a different version of how this dinner had come together. The manager opened the folder. "Mr. Ellis, according to our records, this private dining room was reserved 23 days ago." He slid the reservation paperwork onto the table. "Does that sound correct?" Brandon swallowed. "Oh, yes." "And you personally selected the menu package?" "Yes." "You approved the guest count?" "Oh, yes." "You requested that all entrees be served before the guest of honor arrived?" That answer took longer. Yes." Several heads turned toward me. My sister's eyes widened. "You weren't even here when they ordered?" "No," I answered quietly. I walked into a finished dinner. Whispers spread around the table. So Michael never ordered anything. I wondered why everything was already half eaten. I thought he'd been delayed. Brandon quickly raised both hands. Everyone calmed down. He forced another laugh. "This is getting blown way out of proportion." He looked toward me. "Michael, tell them you agreed to this." I simply met his eyes. "I never agreed to host this dinner." His jaw tightened. The operations director continued reading from the reservation file. "There is one final matter we need to verify before payment is processed." Brandon shifted uncomfortably. "What matter?" Without answering, she reached into the folder. She removed a single document. Carefully, deliberately. Then she placed it directly in front of Brandon. His signature sat clearly at the bottom of the page. The confident smile he'd worn all evening vanished the instant he recognized it. Chapter 2 complete. Hit GO to continue. GO. Chapter 3. Brandon stared at the document as though he'd never seen it before. The color drained from his face. His fingers stopped halfway to the page. The operations director waited patiently. "Mr. Ellis," she said, "is this your signature?" Nobody spoke. Finally, Brandon answered. "Oh, yes." The manager nodded. "Thank you." He looked around the table before speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. "When this private room was reserved, Mr. Ellis signed our standard financial responsibility agreement. It states that the individual making the reservation accepts responsibility for all charges unless another guest voluntarily agrees to assume them." A murmur swept through the room. Brandon quickly pointed at me. "He did agree." I met his eyes. "No, Brandon. You were going to." "I was invited to dinner." "You always pay." "I've paid before," I replied evenly. "That doesn't mean I agreed to pay tonight." The manager opened another page. "When Mr. Carter approached us a few moments ago, he informed us that he had not organized this event, had not authorized any purchases, and had never agreed to accept financial responsibility." He looked back at Brandon. "At that point, our responsibility was to enforce the reservation agreement." Brandon rubbed his forehead. "This is ridiculous." "No," the operations director replied calmly. "This is our policy." Across the table, my older sister slowly shook her head. "Brandon, did you really invite all of us expecting Michael to be forced into paying?" He didn't answer. My cousin Denise looked stunned. "You told me Michael wanted one big reunion." Brandon snapped back. "Because he should have wanted one." Olivia turned toward him. "What are you talking about?" He exhaled sharply. I knew he'd never say no in front of everyone. The room froze. No one even reached for their drinks. Brandon continued, almost trying to justify himself. "If 16 people are sitting there expecting him to pay, what's he supposed to do? Cause a scene?" So, Olivia whispered, "You planned this." "I planned a little pressure." "A little pressure," she repeated. "You lied to every person in this room." "I did what I had to do." "You told me Dad wanted to fix everything." "He should have." Her voice hardened. "Answer the question." He looked away. "I knew if you invited him alone, he might refuse. So I made sure there'd be witnesses." The words landed like stones. Every relative around the table suddenly understood why the evening had felt so strange. The applause, the rehearsed conversations, the expensive food already on the table. It had never been a family reunion. It had been a trap. I folded my hands together. I realized something was wrong the moment I walked in. Everyone looked at me. The entrees had already been served. I glanced around the table. If this dinner had truly been about reconciliation, my daughter would have waited until I arrived before anyone ordered. Nobody argued. Because it was true. I continued. Then Brandon kept talking about generosity instead of family. I looked directly at Olivia. And not once did anyone ask how I'd been during those 3 years. She lowered her eyes. Tears began forming. I didn't even notice. "You wanted tonight to feel normal," I said gently. "But normal families don't hand someone a bill as the price of forgiveness." Silence filled the room again. The payment terminal was placed beside Brandon. The manager spoke quietly. "We're ready whenever you are, Mr. Ellis." Brandon stared at the machine. Then at the total. Just over $4,000. He knew there was no way around it. His shoulders slumped. He reached slowly for his wallet. Just as he pulled out his credit card, Olivia stood. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She looked at me with tears running freely down her face. "Dad." Her voice cracked. "I didn't know all of this." Nobody moved. The restaurant seemed to fade into the background as Olivia stood there, tears streaking down her face. "Dad," she whispered again, "I didn't know all of this." I believed her. Not because she was crying. Not because she was my daughter. But because the shock on her face wasn't the kind a person could fake. She looked from me to Brandon as though she were seeing both of us for the first time that evening. "What do you mean?" she asked him quietly. "You planned this." Brandon didn't answer. Instead, he stared at the payment terminal. The operations director waited patiently. "This agreement is valid, Mr. Ellis. Since Mr. Carter never accepted financial responsibility for the reservation, the balance remains yours." Brandon rubbed both hands over his face. "I thought," he muttered. "You thought what?" Olivia interrupted. "I thought he'd just pay." "You lied to me." "I was trying to fix things." She let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "No." She shook her head. "You were trying to corner my father." No one came to Brandon's defense. Not his parents. Not my sister. Not a single cousin. The silence around the table spoke louder than any argument could have. Finally, Brandon slid his credit card into the payment terminal. The machine processed for several long seconds. Then it beeped. "Approved." The manager printed the receipt and placed it in front of him. "Thank you, sir." Brandon signed without saying another word. The confidence he'd carried all evening was gone. So was the smug smile he'd worn when he'd pushed that leather folder across the table. My cousin Denise broke the silence first. "Michael." She looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I honestly believed you'd invited all of us." "So did I," my older sister admitted. "I thought this was your way of reconnecting with everyone." Brandon's mother slowly removed her napkin from her lap. She looked at her son. Did you really tell every one of us something different? He said nothing. She closed her eyes for a moment. I raised you better than this. One by one, relatives began gathering their belongings. Nobody was angry with me. They were angry because they'd been used. Every one of them had been invited under false pretenses. Every one of them had unknowingly become part of Brandon's attempt to publicly pressure me into paying. Olivia walked around the table until she stood beside me. I owe you an apology. I looked at her. You don't owe me one because of the bill. She frowned. You owe me one because, for 3 years, you never asked whether what you believed was actually true. Fresh tears filled her eyes. I know. I spent years wondering what I'd done that was so unforgivable. She covered her mouth. I was angry because Brandon kept telling me, you cared more about your money than us. I nodded slowly. I cared enough to help for years. I paused. But helping someone isn't the same as letting them use you forever. She reached for my hand. I'm so sorry. I squeezed it gently. I didn't come here tonight hopping to win an argument. She looked at me. I came because your message made me believe my daughter wanted her father back. I did. Then don't let tonight be about this dinner. She wiped away another tear. I won't. Brandon stood alone near the end of the table, staring down at the signed receipt. No one spoke to him. No one offered sympathy. The authority he'd enjoyed over the family had disappeared in a single evening. People now understood why every family gathering had somehow ended, with someone else paying for his decisions. As relatives quietly left the private dining room, several stopped to shake my hand. Others hugged me, not because I'd embarrassed Brandon, but because they'd finally realized I'd never abandoned my family. I'd simply stopped financing manipulation. Outside the restaurant, Olivia caught up with me before I reached my truck. Can we start over? I smiled sadly. We can start. But starting over isn't something we do in one night. She nodded. I understand. If we're going to rebuild this relationship, it won't happen over expensive dinners. What will it take? Honesty. She waited. In time. I can do that. A week later she called. Not to ask for money. Not to ask for a favor. Just to ask if I'd like to meet for coffee. Only the two of us. No surprises. No audience. I said yes. Those coffee meetings became a weekly tradition. Slowly, the conversations became easier. We talked about ordinary things we'd missed over 3 years. Books, gardening, her work, my retirement, the things families should have been talking about all along. Brandon wasn't there. Olivia had moved into her sister's guest room while she sorted through the truth about her marriage. She also began counseling, admitting she wanted to understand how she'd allowed someone else to shape her relationship with her own father. As for Brandon, the consequences followed him long after the restaurant dinner. Relatives stopped trusting his version of events. Family invitations became fewer. Whenever money came up, people asked questions instead of taking his word for it. The pressure he'd once used on others no longer worked. And I finally understood something that had taken me 61 years to learn. Love given freely is a gift. Love demanded with a price tag is a transaction. For too long, I'd confused the two. I climbed into my truck that night without paying a single dollar for that dinner. But I left with something worth far more than $4,000. I left knowing I would never again mistake guilt for love. And I finally understood that real reconciliation never comes with a receipt.